Lavender Literary Society members, good evening and welcome to our second edition of Book Club. Today we embark on a voyage through the vivid landscapes of queer culture, guided by the vibrant pages of the books we'll spend time with over the course of the months ahead. As we gather in this virtual space, we are not merely readers but trailblazers, forging connections that transcend time and generations. Our mission is clear: to honor our history, celebrate our present, and pave the way for a future steeped in understanding and unity. Within the covers of our chosen books, we will discover more than stories. We will uncover the essence of resilience, the beauty of diversity, and the power of solidarity. With each turn of the page, we become architects of change, weaving our experiences into a tapestry of strength and pride. But this book club is more than just words on a page. It's a movement, a force for empowerment, and a testament to the indomitable spirit of the LGBTQ+ community. Together, we will traverse the rich terrain of queer history and memoir, guided by inspiring authors and iconic guest facilitators. So let us not only read, but immerse ourselves in the magic of storytelling as we journey through the narratives that define us, inspire us, and connect us. For in this space, our voices are heard, our stories are celebrated, and our collective spirit shines brightly. Welcome to the American LGBTQ+ Museum Book Club, where every page turned is a step forward in our shared quest for understanding, empathy, pride, and queer liberation. My name is Suhaili Bautista Carolina. I am a brown-skinned woman wearing red lipstick, face-shaped gold earrings, a messy bun on top of my head, and a floral dress. I'm also sitting in front of a white background. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Partnerships at the American LGBTQ+ Museum, a new collaboration dedicated to preserving, researching, and sharing LGBTQ+ history and culture that will open its first galleries in New York City in 2027. However, we like to say that you do not have to wait that long to experience the queer magic of the American LGBTQ+ Museum. In fact, you're experiencing it right now. We are already producing and presenting dynamic public programming as well as traveling exhibitions centered on LGBTQ+ history and culture, and I encourage you to check us out, follow us on social media, become a founding member, attend a program, and stay engaged as our story continues to unfold. Before we begin, I'd like to share our virtual land acknowledgement. While we are gathered in virtual space today, we are each tuning in from our respective Indigenous lands. I myself join you from present-day New York City, the unceded homeland of the Lenape people. We respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to the territories on which we reside and gather, and we honor the energy and stewardship of these lands by all Indigenous generations, past, present, and future. Now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's author, Dr. Cookie Woolner. Dr. Cookie Woolner is an associate professor of history at the University of Memphis, where she teaches classes on modern U.S. history, the histories of women and gender, queer histories, and the history of popular culture and music. Her first book, which is our May Book Club book, The Famous Lady Lovers, Black Women and Queer Desire Before Stonewall, was published in 2023 on the University of North Carolina Press Gender and American Culture series and was nominated for the Judy Grant Award for Lesbian Nonfiction from the Publishing Triangle. Woolner has also published in periodicals from Harper's Bazaar to the Journal of African American History, has recently been interviewed by NBC News and Time Magazine, and her book has received accolades from Ms. Magazine and the Library Journal, among other outlets. She currently lives in Memphis, Tennessee, with her formerly feral cats, Bessie and Loretta. And we are so happy to welcome tonight's host, Brontez Purnell. Brontez Purnell is a writer, musician, dancer, filmmaker, and performance artist. He is the author of a graphic novel, a novella, a children's book, the novel Since I Laid My Burden Down, and 100 Boyfriends, a collection of stories. The recipient of 2018 Whiting Award in Fiction, he was named one of 32 Black male writers of our time by T, the New York Times Style magazine in 2018. Purnell is also the frontman for the band The Younger Lovers, a co-founder of the experimental dance group, the Brontez Purnell Dance Company, the creator of the renowned cult zine Fag School, and the director of several short films, music videos, and the documentary Unstoppable Feet, The Dances of Ed Mock. Born in Triana, Alabama, he lives in Oakland, California, and has lived there for more than a decade. Now, without further ado, I welcome Cookie and Brontez to the virtual stage.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Just like to say thank you to Suhaili, Lucy, and everyone at the American LGBTQ Plus Museum for inviting me and for my book to be featured in your important new book club, the Lavender Literary Society. So just to give a visual description, I am a white Jewish middle-aged fat woman. I have brown wavy hair to my shoulders. I'm wearing a sleeveless green dress with blue and pink flowers on it. Got some tattoos peeking out of my arms, including a giant peacock. And I have a cute double chin and a blurred background behind me, but you can see that there's a lot of plants. And I'm going to start by just reading a short excerpt from my book before Brontez joins us. So I'm going to start at the beginning. I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs from my introduction to kind of set the stage with my middle-aged glasses. All right, so the introduction is called Have We a New Sex Problem Here? I'm just going to read a few paragraphs from it. In November of 1920, the Black newspaper, the Chicago Whip, ran a front-page article with the provocative headline, Have We a New Sex Problem Here? The short article detailed an incident involving a married couple and another woman, describing the situation as one of the most peculiar divorce cases to yet be heard in Chicago. After 6 years of marital bliss and harmony, Ida Mae Robinson had forsaken her husband, Sherman Robinson, when she left him without any cause for a woman whom she had formerly known in Paducah, Kentucky. According to their landlord, the two women had been living together in a boarding house prior to the official divorce. The possibility that a woman would leave her husband to enter a romantic relationship with another woman was something that the journalist had never heard of before. This was shocking to them. To live with a woman in a family unit was a new concept for the anonymous journalist. So shocking was this notion that the author wondered whether Ida Mae Robinson and her partner heralded a new sex problem. The here to which the headline referred was the rapidly growing Black district of Bronzeville on Chicago's South Side, which was now filled with recent Southern migrants, like Robinson, who were escaping the Jim Crow South. By 1920, the Great Migration, a mass exodus of African Americans from the South to the North and West, was in full swing. The Black population of Chicago had more than doubled since 1910, and women now outnumbered men. Many of these Black Southern migrants were young and single, and they often lived in boarding houses like the one in Bronzeville where Robinson and her partner made a home. The Chicago Whip, like many Black newspapers, was started and run by college-educated, middle-class African Americans from the North. Often referred to as old settlers, their families had lived above the Mason-Dixon line for a number of generations. For this more established and educated class of Northern African Americans, the sexual deportment of an ever-growing population of new settlers like Ida Mae Robinson was of great concern, not least because it clashed so strikingly with an established politics of respectability designed to present Black people as fit for full citizenship in the age of Jim Crow. Respectability in this context demanded hewing to traditional gender roles, which did not involve women leaving their husbands for other women. Black women's historians have long attended to the lives of African American queer women before the era of gay liberation. Prior historical work has delved into the political, intellectual, and artistic lives of some of these women, but their intimate lives remain unexplored. This book, in contrast and complement to this rich tradition, places Black queer women and their intimate lives at the center of the narrative. The Stonewall Uprising of 1969 is normally used to demarcate the emergence of modern gay communities and the beginning of the modern gay liberation period. But this book reveals a queer world that Black women crafted many decades prior, which coalesced in the 1920s. Black lady lovers, as women who love women were then known, fashioned modern new identities, social networks, and gathering spaces in the interwar era. This book examines the lives of well-known women like popular blues singer Bessie Smith, along with many everyday women uncovered in the archives, like Ida Mae Robinson. Using a wide array of sources like Black newspapers, Vice reports, blues songs, memoirs, sexology case studies, and letters, I showed that Black queer women were emergent cultural figures in new Black districts of the urban North. To the Black press and other male authorities, they came to symbolically represent the social chaos of increasingly racially diverse modern cities, as sexually active women separated from the domestic sphere and the heteronormative family unit. However, despite the multiple oppressions Black lady lovers experienced, they created careers, relationships, cultural texts, and networks that enriched interwar American culture. Black queer women's relationships in the urban North modeled new forms of modernity. They revealed that many women prioritized romantic relationships with other women over and alongside traditional marriage and motherhood. Black lady lovers strategically created queer networks inside and outside of the Black entertainment industry and intellectual circles that allowed them to take part in the newly emerging sexual subcultures of the early 20th century. And I will stop here, and my dear old friend Brontez Purnell is going to join us now.
Hello, my name is Brontez Purnell. I am a dark-skinned African-American fat gay man. I have salt and pepper hair. I'm wearing glasses. I have a nose ring, and I'm wearing a blue and white, a red, white, and blue flannel, which feels oddly patriotic now that I say that out loud. And I'm sitting in the kitchen, and I am very, very thrilled to be here with my old friend, Cookie. So, oh gosh, I don't even know where to start. Just a little background. I basically grew up at Cookie's house. When I moved to San Francisco in 2002, she had an amazing feminist house that I kind of parked at and slept on the couch and was there, felt like every other day at points. But I do remember when you went to school and you were starting to do your research on this. Um, I guess I would say, why exactly this period? Like, I noticed I've never even thought of the term pre-Stonewall because I do often, I guess we don't really think about it, but I'm like, that is actually an interesting era back before, I don't know. They weren't even using the word lesbian, right?
Yeah, no, it's just beginning to be used. There's an amazing article in like 1926 talking about a Broadway play that features lesbians. And the writer is like, lesbian is a term you might not have heard before. Like basically like introducing the concept to people. But also before then, it had just been kind of used as kind of a generic term referring to kind of romantic love between women, which is kind of how people talked about, you know, Sappho and lesbianism before then. But yeah, in the 20s, the term is kind of coalescing a little bit more, but yeah, women very very rarely identify as lesbians really until like the 60s and 70s. That's why the term lady lovers is more kind of used in the time period itself. And as to like how I became interested in the time period, actually my first entrance kind of into queer history was through watching a documentary, just kind of like randomly one day that was showing at the Castro Theater in San Francisco, called Paragraph 175, which was about like the experiences of queer people in the Holocaust. And there were all these images of like vibrant Berlin life in the 1930s, which I knew nothing about, and it just made me realize that I knew nothing about queer life before Stonewall myself. So that's really kind of what set me on that path. But beyond that, I had really no interest in, you know, German history. So I was focused more on lesbian history, and had already kind of learned about the blues women through work I did in fat studies as an undergrad. I learned like Bessie Smith has a song where she talks about weighing 200 pounds. Ma Rainey was a large woman, and that's like studying learning about them and the way they kind of sang about sexuality and were really unabashed about, you know, their bodies and their sexuality at the time really kind of blew me away. And so then when I went to study lesbian history, like a decade later in grad school, I was like, oh, well, those blues women, they were queer. Like that's kind of an entry point, because also I realized that as I started learning about lesbian history, you know, 15, 20 years ago, it was mostly, you know, written by and about white women. So I really wanted to bring women of color in more. And so the blues women kind of became the entrance into the project. And originally the book was really just about the blues women. I kind of assumed since they were more well known that there'd be more sources kind of about them and their queerness. But I mean, they really, aside from teasing a little bit like Ma Rainey does with her song Prove It On Me Blues, someone like Bessie Smith was having relationships with women while she was married to a man, but she, didn't talk about that publicly at all. So I kind of realized that these women had a lot to lose really at the time, in this incredibly conservative era, in the Jim Crow era, to talk about their queerness. But then when I made it into the archives, I started finding stories like the one I started with, kind of about these more anonymous everyday women and, them coming to the North and having like all women's parties that the police were breaking up. So then I realized there was kind of a larger story there, that the entertainment world was part of it. And the entertainment world is also really important, right? Because this is a time when most Black women who haven't gone to college often have to do like domestic work, maid work, laundress work, cook work. So the fact that like thousands of women were able to work as chorus girls, as dancers, as singers in vaudeville and in these, Black popular entertainment industries was like really important, right? I mean, it was a type of work that there was, it didn't have the same meaning for white women to do that type of work in a way, right? The way it represented a new option and a new freedom and allowed women to travel around the country and, sometimes even internationally.
Oh my gosh. So where do the archives live? That's another thing that I was kind of wondering about as I was reading this. Like the sources. I hope that's not too granular of a question, but
No, yeah, no, they're all over the country. I mean, I'm currently in Memphis where I don't have any really local, well, the book is done now, right? So it's kind of a moot point, but yeah, so not too many local sources here, although I did actually do some research in the South. I really wanted this to be more of a Southern story too, since so many of the women are from the South, but really everything I found about queer communities was in the North. So it kind of became more of a Northern story, but I spent 2 years in New York using a ton of different archives there. But yeah, I mean, it probably started with sources from like, actually in San Francisco, we have the GLBTH Historical Society there. Like a lot of what I do at the beginning is kind of build off of like the earlier work on kind of queer Harlem Renaissance. And so you'll kind of go into archives and like there's a man named Eric Garber who wrote an early piece on the queer Harlem Renaissance who died of AIDS, I think in the late 80s. And he has this amazing archive of all his research on it. So I kind of started by like, going over his research and the research of folks like Angela Davis, who wrote a really amazing book, Blues Legacies and Black Feminism, right? So of course we have these certain associations with Angela Davis in terms of, her activism, but she also wrote this incredible book about Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey and Billie Holiday. And that's where I first started thinking about how they were so kind of transgressive in terms of talking about sexuality, right? She talks a lot about their sexual subjectivity and the way that they're unconventional in terms of white dominant beauty norms, but they're still unabashedly talking about their desires in this really kind of profound way. And they're also really speaking like specifically to Black women and kind of hailing Black women through their lyrics as well. Sometimes that even start with something like, now I want all you women to listen to me, and they're kind of like doling out advice, right? So yeah, so the really archives are all over. And also but yeah, there's definitely a lot of piecework, right? The more marginal your historical subjects are, the harder it can be to get at their actual voices. And that's one of the challenges, right? Many of the sources are more what we would call outsider sources, like Vice sources or newspaper sources or, sermons about women. It's harder to get at the actual sources themselves of women's voices because those sources so often like weren't seen as like, important, worthy documents of saving 100 years ago often, right? Unless I do have the one chapter, chapter 4 talks more about elite women, some of whom are college educated. And so they're going to have more sources, right? They wrote a lot of letters and kept their letters and things like that, right? But for, yeah, of all the blues women, Alberta Hunter has a very, very small collection at the Schomburg in New York, which was a really important archive for me, along with also like the Lesbian History Archives in New York, which is amazing, which was started by queer femme Joan Nessel, who I love. And yeah, that has some amazing oral histories like Mabel Hampton, who's a central figure in the book as well.
cool.
So kind of by piecing together kind of insider and outsider sources, I was able to get enough to create a book. It's still a pretty slim book. It sure took a long time to come out so slim, but it's the only slim thing about me, my book.
Slim but very potent. I kind of was just interested in the fact that I think even today in media, we kind of wrestle with this idea of like Black femmehood being kind of associated with quote unquote ratchetness or kind of these bold. I think of like the rapper girls and all this stuff. And I was just thinking that the first introduction American society has to Black lady lovers is these kind of articles about violence. Like they're kind of, was
Exactly.
it,
Yeah.
how did you, was this something like documented, or was this something that you noticed like as you were going, that there was only like these sensational stories about stabbings and shootings, or
Yeah, yeah, no, it was very notable. And one way that actually really stood out more was, of course, at one point I had to kind of raise the question of well, what about Black queer men? How are they being portrayed in like the papers and the press at this time? Like, I'm not reading any accounts of them, murdering each other and things like that. But what you do get are all these fabulous reviews of the drag balls in Harlem. Sometimes they're even including like images of the dresses that the queens are wearing and everything. So it's kind of this, in this way we have, like the assumption of Black queer men as kind of like feminized and harmless and, taking part in this like performative femininity through the drag ball circuits, and Black queer women assumed to be, masculine, aggressive, violent, taking part in these acts of violent jealousy. And that's, also we get this kind of the stereotype around like, the jealousy between queer women as well, which is kind of, maybe a little bit of a stereotype still today. And then after this era, we go into like, the kind of the real emergence of like lesbian bars in the post-World War II era. We have like amazing books like Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, which is about the working class butch femme kind of bar community that emerges in Buffalo, New York specifically. And there's often like a lot of, violence between working class queer women at the time, like whether it's, them actually defending themselves from, heterosexual violence from men on the street, or, butches fighting over femmes, femmes fighting over butches. So it's, yeah, that stereotype, it seems like it a little bit emerges in my book, but we don't quite, there's definitely discussion in the women in my book around, gender difference between couples. Sometimes like they'll talk about like, the bulldaggers and their women came to the party together, right? Things like that. But, butch femme or stud and femme aren't terms that have really coalesced yet at this time either.
so. I kind of want to move to asking you about the pacing of this book. Like, how long did it take you to write it, and what intervals did you do it in, or
I mean, I basically started when I left San Francisco in 2007 to go to grad school at the University of Michigan. It started out as my dissertation, which, I think the language and the amount of footnotes probably gives that away. I am a nerdy academic for better or worse, but I'm so thrilled that non-academics like want to engage me with it. But this actually started out as a seminar paper just about like 4 or 5 of the queer classic blues women that I wrote in a grad school seminar, like my second year of grad school. And I was actually working on it with 2 different professors, one who focused on like elite literary women in the 19th century, and another who focused on like queer studies and like basically BDSM and history of Leathermen. And they both loved the project, and they were coming from like such different places that I was like, wow, if these two like women's history, feminist, queer studies scholars coming from incredibly different places, like both are excited about my project. Maybe I'm onto something here. So that's kind of how it started. So yeah, no, it literally started from a seminar paper I wrote in 2009, and it was published in 2023. So that's that's the academic book process. I mean, it does take sometimes a little bit shorter than that, but it's not like out of left field to take that long for something.
no, no, for sure, especially like with this type of research. So the dissertation happened first, and then yeah, like you were
Yeah,
archiving and putting it all together. Meticulous work.
yeah. No, most of the archival research was done while I was dissertating. And I did write one new chapter, the 4th chapter, that deals with kind of more middle class women, high society women of different types. And that part was a little exciting because I got to do some research at Howard University in the archives there, and really kind of get my hands on actually like there was like a love letter sent between two Black queer women in the late 19th century. It was literally from like the 1890s. And I got to like hold it in my hands wearing, fancy little gloves that you get to wear in the archives when you're holding pieces of paper that are about to disintegrate. And I probably like teared up a little bit because it's the type of source that I've been like reading and writing about for decades now. And I never really got to hold, something from that like material culture of that aspect like in my actual hands. So yeah, getting to go actually into archives and seeing the actual sources is really, really amazing. Like one of the women I read about, Lucy Diggs Slowe, she was the first dean of female students at Howard University. And she lived with her partner, Mary Buell, who was a playwright who wrote, actually, she wrote some amazing plays. I've been working on another short piece about how the first 3 plays that are like basically like activist plays against lynching were all written by Black queer women. And like, is that kind of just a coincidence or not, right? When one of them was Mary Buell, who was the partner of Lucy Diggs Slowe. And so they lived together off campus. But this was the 30s, and they still, it was Howard University. They were like as respectable as they could be, right? So they kind of, their relationship was modeled. It wasn't so much like spicy 1920s lady lovers, but it was more kind of like the older concepts we think of for the 19th century, which we talk about these notions of like romantic friendships or Boston marriages, this idea of kind of like 2 women living together, but you're kind of just like, oh, are they just kind of like 2 spinsters who could never find a man? Or, are they like, what is their relationship like? Everybody knew that they were like best friends and like sisters. And when Lucy Slowe dies, Mary Buell receives literally hundreds. I got to go through, there was like over 300 letters of, just offering condolences. And they all said things like, we know you've lost your closest friend and you'll be together again in heaven. And like for years after she died, Mary Buell leaves like fresh flowers every day in a vase next to a photo of Lucy, right? But no one, of course, they don't call themselves partners or wives, of course, or anything, lady lovers. They don't use any of these terms, right? So yeah, so it's and there might be some people who are, would still strongly say like, you can't prove that they had a romantic or sexual relationship, right? And that kind of that becomes like one of the larger problems. But in some ways it's a privilege to just mostly deal with people 100 years ago, because you can do that type of research without really like actually having to, talk to somebody's relative or, talk to the actual people. So I definitely admire folks who deal with contemporary subjects and talk to actual living humans. So
Oh,
that's definitely, because there's just so many like politics and ethics around all of that, right?
no, for sure. I guess I kind of want to move back and kind of talk about just like bodies, right? I spend way too much time on Instagram, and what I notice is that there'll be these little clips of like they'll be on in New York in like the early 1900s and filming like a group of a 30-second clip of people walking, and in the comments are like, look, not one fat person like today, you know, which I kind of just like, there's no way that fat people did not exist. Um kind of in the early 1900s. And I'm looking at this list of Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey and these like very voluptuous bodies.
Yeah, and Gladys Bentley too, who was, she was more masculine, and wore men's pants in the street in this time, which was, very subversive. But yeah, she was like one of the most popular performers in Harlem, mostly because she'd mostly perform in spaces that really only let white women in. That's another aspect of this. She was kind of more of a star of this slumming realm, right? So in some ways she's being seen kind of like as a spectacle. So a lot of people really aren't a fan of her because they think she's people are kind of coming to make fun of her even. But yeah, but plenty of white women are like throwing themselves at her. They view her as very desirable. So yeah, so we have some, large and lovely folks who are putting themselves out there. And also it's important because yeah, in the 1920s, the flapper era, I talk to my students a lot in my women's history class, especially about how we have this really thin ideal in the 1920s, right? It's like no coincidence, not all, but some women get the right to vote in 1920. And like suddenly we have this really thin androgynous flapper look. So, of course we can see how it's about kind of coming into the masculine public sphere, right? And women feeling like as they have more rights, they need to kind of, appear more androgynous. So even women who still identified, as feminine would sometimes even like bind their breasts. So the fact that, we have like fat people taking up space in this era is even in more notable kind of in that regard as well, right? The fact that we have these like super thin norms at the time.
I actually had no idea about the history of Gladys Bentley at all until this like book.
Yeah, no, she's been getting a little bit more notoriety. Thanks to me a little bit, I've been in a documentary about her and done a few podcasts about her. But yeah, she was a really popular figure. She was somebody who actually yeah, Langston Hughes loved her. We talked before about how actually a lot of the more kind of like elite figures in the Harlem Renaissance would be considered more of like the old settlers, right? Like I mentioned, who actually like, also just, they just want to kind of cultivate a very like urbane sophistication in New York, right? They want to distance themselves from like anything rural and southern and country, right? Like Ma Rainey she was from Georgia. She would sometimes play with a jug band. Like she wasn't a huge star in New York. Like no one with like playing with a jug band is going to be like a huge star at this time, Bessie Smith was seen as, even though she was larger and dark skinned, she wasn't like thin and light skinned like someone like Ethel Waters, who was probably like the most successful in that kind of more like sophisticated realm. Bessie Smith, she would play with folks like Louis Armstrong, and so she was seen as like a little even more sophisticated than somebody like Ma Rainey specifically. But yeah, Langston Hughes was one of the exceptions of like a northern, elite writer in the Harlem Renaissance who loved the blues and loved Southern culture. And yeah, he wrote all about Gladys Bentley. Although notably, he wrote about her in very kind of a language that kind of smacks of what historians refer to as like primitivism at the time. Like I don't have the piece right in front of me, but he's like, she looks like this beautiful African sculpture playing the piano all night long. When we talk about primitivism, when I talk about it in class, I often show students Josephine Baker dancing in her banana skirt. Which, did you actually get to see a piece of that when you were just in Paris?
It was in Marseille. Part of her
Yeah.
original banana skirt was in Marseille, and I sat there and I cried and I looked at it and I contemplated smashing the glass and taking it, but my knee hurt and I thought they'd probably catch me, so I didn't. Um, Not to LARP on this too much, but where did Gladys come from? Was she a northerner or was she a southerner?
Yeah, no, she actually grew up outside of Philadelphia, and she was someone who was like, yeah, pretty, tomboyish, masculine from a young age, had a crush on her teacher, and she ran away from, very classic queer story. She ran away from home when her parents wanted to send her to like conversion therapy, like a classic story of the early to mid 20th century, even sadly into the late 20th century. And I'm sure there's versions of that still going on today. They might, use different terms for it. But yeah, she just like arrived. She was a teenager when she showed up in Harlem in the mid 20s, and she was already a piano player, and she was able to get hired pretty soon. She actually got her first job. They wanted to hire a male piano player, and she was like, well, I'll be perfect then. So she gets hired, and yeah, I mean, there's one video clip. There's one, if you search for her on YouTube, there's one clip of her. It's from later in life. It's from the 1950s, but she's on like a Marx Brothers show, and she plays the piano, and you can get like a little taste of what she would have been like, because like this is a lot later. There's also kind of a sad story where once we get into the 1950s, it's a very, very conservative time, right? So there's a lot of pressure to like denounce your queerness. And she does that. She writes about being kind of feminine again and heterosexual and married in an article in Ebony that's actually has the depressing title of "I am a woman again." And so she like represents herself as feminine, right? Trying to kind of, just be seen like, as human and respectable in like a very conservative time, right? We even talk in the 1950s, not just the Red Scare against communism, but also the Lavender Scare. So we have a lot of, it's more kind of, affecting privileged folks, more like white gay men who work in the government are getting fired from their jobs because they're seen as easy to blackmail in the very conservative, like in the McCarthy era, right? So, it's understandable that, a very transgressive performer might try to reinvent themselves to be seen, as more respectable in that time period. But it's also just another sign of how, in some ways, we like there was so much permission for kind of transgression in the Prohibition era. Prohibition just extends from 1920 to 1933, but everybody enjoys kind of breaking the law. These speakeasies pop up. When Black in New York could have like 100 speakeasies, maybe I'm exaggerating, but like dozens of speakeasies. They're popping up in everybody's basements and stores, and everyone's really enjoying, drinking illegal bootleg alcohol. And then they're like, oh, maybe I'll break another norm. Maybe I'll flirt with someone of a different race or a different sex, or there might be gambling or drug use or sex work going on. So all these different kind of like taboo behaviors are kind of intermingling. But then things get much more conservative when it ends. And that's what starts the new period in which it becomes illegal for queer people to gather where alcohol is sold. And that's the beginning of the period in which we have raids on bars. And that's why something like Stonewall happened. Stonewall was just kind of an everyday type of raid on the bar. And queer folks decided to fight back that night. And there'd been other events like that before. Like it wasn't the first time it had happened. But yeah, that's like the Stonewall occurs because of this legacy that starts at the end of Prohibition, where it become basically, if queer people are gathering somewhere where alcohol is served, it's determined to be just like when they use these vague catch-all terms at the time, disorderly, and that's illegal. So yeah. So that's why we get the rise of like gay bars being run by the mafia and other fun things like that.
I remember when I was younger, and I guess I was looking through your library, and there was that one book you had, Voluptuous Panic, and I remember you saying to me, like, we have family all throughout history, Brontez. And
Yes, that was the Weimar Berlin book that started it all. Yes. Well, that book,
yeah.
I got that book after I saw the documentary, but those were like, yeah, my historical sources that kind of sent me on my journey back to the 1920s.
Oh yeah, and it's like we were queer party kids of sorts. Uh,
Exactly. Yeah, no, I mean, it's because I got to be part of this, like, of course, now I, used to live there, but I don't, I'm in Memphis, Tennessee now. So I romanticize it so much. I'm like, I got to be part of this amazing queer community in my 20s, Of course, there was a lot of drama, as there always is, but it's easy to kind of forget about that as the years go by. But yeah, I mean, I would, me and you and all our friends, we were, in bands, we were, doing burlesque, doing spoken word, dancing, making videos, doing art. And this was a time when it was so much more, affordable to live there. And yeah, it was really through having that experience that made me want to learn more about, queer subcultures in the past. And, just
I often get stuck on this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, you're good. I'm done. Go.
I often get stuck on this idea of I don't know what the if what visibility has brought us, for better or for worse. Because I do often think it just seems like these people were freaking wilding, you know? And I was like, I wonder if the cloak of people not even having access to us yet is something that aided in that. I feel like sometimes I'll be online and some straight guy will be making fun of me. He'll be like, yeah, whatever, queen, slay, boots. And I'm like, oh, they've weaponized their language against us. They know everything. They know too much. um, does I guess the question is mostly about how did visibility pop up, or these these people were still able to kind of cloak themselves within speakeasies
Yeah.
and
Also, I think, yeah, for women, there's been, so queer women's relationships have been more hidden in the past, right? There's kind of like these long-standing assumptions around, women innately, being less sexual, right? Like boys will be boys, etc. And this assumption within heterosexual, thinking that, women are always the ones who give it up, right? Who are passive, don't actually have their own actual sexual desires. They're just like having sex because men want them, right? And then when you apply these ideas to queerness, it's as if like, well, how could two women even have sex or have a relationship if there's not a man with a penis present to like be the active figure, right? So kind of because of these ideas, in some ways, queer women have really been able to, have kind of secret relationships that people haven't even really noticed or thought about. And as I mentioned, like, terms like um, lesbianism are not really very in use yet. Um, so yeah, things are in some ways, the lack of visibility was able to be a privilege, but then you need to kind of have visibility to create community, right? And to, fight for rights. So that's kind of the larger thing. And this is something, it's kind of like, yeah, when I teach like queer history classes, it's kind of this thing we start with, before we have the rise of queer identities, we just have queer behaviors. Queer behaviors have always existed, but queer identities are newer. And this part often confuses students because they kind of conflate the two. And it's like, no, I didn't just say that queer people haven't always existed. I said queer desires have always existed. But the idea of being like being queer is like this discrete part of my identity and my personality. You know, Foucault has showed us that this is like a modern concept, right? This starts in kind of like the late 19th century. And this is, you know, these are all like Western notions of this. Obviously, other cultures and societies have thought about it differently. But yeah, so in some ways, like before the rise of queer identities, it seemed like it could have been safer for people to have these relationships and interactions because people wouldn't know what they meant or it didn't have the significance yet, right? But then once we have the emergence of the identities, people can find each other, but there's going to be more pushback and resistance to the visibility, right? So it's always kind of a question, right? Of visibility and like the kind of the good of it and the harm that it can bring as well. And of course, also for queerness, visibility has often so much been linked to gender transgression specifically, right? I guess that's either going to be, you know, two women holding hands or, and this is a period in which, you know, since it wasn't fully like butch femme coded yet, like maybe two women holding hands of who are feminine could mean something to, yeah, it's a little bit hard to say still. But yeah, these are just a lot of the issues that are really, really hard to get at when you're studying more kind of marginal groups because they're not thinking and writing about these ideas in the way we think about them now. You know, they have totally different priorities. So that's another kind of, you know, one of the challenges of being a historian is not just kind of putting your own priorities, you know, onto the past, but really just trying to, you know, understand what it meant, how things worked in their time and what it meant in their time, right? And then we could think about how things have changed since then.
Yeah, I guess there was one point where I was reading Lady Sings the Blues, and I was always obsessed with this part where Billie Holiday has this like white lesbian lover up in Harlem. And there's a passage where she's just like, yeah, I always felt sorry for the boys because they can't walk around in public like me and this woman can. And I'm always thinking about, I don't know, just the intersectionalness and how exciting it must have been. Um, so I think we're at the mark where we should take questions.
Great.
Um,
Sounds good.
well, but before
Okay.
that though, I totally want to write the TV show for this. Can I?
Please do. I mean, I've been thinking more like documentary, but yeah, TV show. Also, yeah, I mean, I know of at least one queer historian who's about to do stuff with like virtual reality. So, you know, in any capacity, like I'm ready to bring the story to a screen. I think people would be very excited about it. So yeah, but if yes, you have experience already in television, I hear. So if you can help me at all, connect me to anybody who might be able to help. I don't even know where to start. But yeah, I mean, yeah, that's why yeah, no, using actors or animation would be amazing because there's very little, you know, archival video footage to use. But beyond that, I think there's such a great story to be told.
Yeah. So there's the questions that'll pop up. I'm gonna throw them at you.
Please do.
The first one is so curious how or whether this book is in dialogue with, forgive me, Sadia
Yeah,
Hartman,
Lydia Hartman.
Sadia Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Intimate Histories of Social Upheaval. In parentheses, it says it seems to cover similar terrain.
Yes, it does. Yeah, so Cydia Hartman is amazing. I think this is her third book. She's written some other books. She's a literary scholar, and she actually she uses this term called critical fabulation, where her book does deal with some of the same characters, but since she's not like a stodgy historian in the same way I am, where you're like, I can't make a claim unless I have like my evidence I can show you, she is able to take some like literary liberties in her stories and kind of she'll, you know, kind of imagine a character she's writing about in the first person who might be like somebody like Gladys Bentley or Mabel Hampton, for example, right? So she kind of talks about them in a little bit of a different way. And queerness isn't the only kind of focus in her book, but it is definitely part of it. So yeah, I mean, I will admit that, you know, I worked in this book for a very long time, and as I was working on it, I was always wondering, I was like, I wonder if any other similar books will come out while I'm working on this book. And her book came out in 2019, but I wasn't concerned because I'm just not in her league. You know, she's like an amazing genius at Columbia. This is her third book. It's incredible. It's won all these awards. You know, we're living in different, you know, we're in different lanes, so it's totally fine. And again, she's not a historian in the same way I am, who's kind of, you know, focused more on my evidence and thinking like, oh, I can't really make this claim. I probably shouldn't say this about this person because I don't really have enough evidence. But since she's a literary scholar, she's able to kind of like take it to another step. And she's a gorgeous writer. It's an amazing book. And I'm always flattered when people mention that our books have anything in common, even though, yeah, it's a little bit of a Venn diagram. So yes, I have nothing but great things to say about it.
So, question two is a bit open-ended. What were some scandalous things you uncovered in your research? I think it all seems pretty scandalous, actually. So I wouldn't even know where you would start to answer that question. I think maybe that, or was there some things that like did make it into the book, stories or histories that you thought?
Oh, yeah, no, there's definitely some things that didn't make it into it. One thing that didn't make it into it, and I think it's actually in Tanisha Ford has a new book. I can't think of the name, but it's about a philanthropist named Molly Moon. And it looks really incredible. So I came across this. So one of the women I write about, Dorothy West, she was kind of one of the youngest writers to be associated with the Harlem Renaissance. But the book she wrote came out a little bit later. So a lot of people kind of associate her more with like the 40s and 50s. But she was a queer literary woman who was having relationships with women, and she basically just wanted to marry a man because she wanted to have a baby. It didn't seem like she really cared about having a husband, but she just kind of wanted to have a kid. But I learned that her and Langston Hughes and a bunch of other Black kind of creative folks in their milieu were going to be in this Russian film in the 1930s, and they all went to Russia to film it. And it was made by this Russian company, and it was going to basically just be about Jim Crow life in the US. But yeah, and like during it, Dorothy West was kind of having all this. Basically, she was kind of in a love triangle with Langston Hughes, who was a little bit bi, or maybe acted like he was a little bit. I'm not sure if he really was or not. And another woman, they were kind of having love triangle drama against the backdrop of them like filming this film in Russia. But it never actually got made or never actually got released because it just ended up being a huge disaster. Basically because these white Russian folks really didn't understand like the context and like the history of like the US and the Jim Crow South at all. But it was just one of those weird stories where I was like, I would love to bring this in somehow, but it just seems kind of like a really random tangent. Like it kind of deserves its own chapter or story, because I just never, I mean, I'm not, I'm a historian, I'm not a literary scholar, so it's not that weird. I'd never come across it, but I was just like, wow, a big group of like literary folks from the Harlem Renaissance were like flown to Russia to make this film that never was released. Like that's very bizarre. But then I guess something more scandalous, which I tried to learn more about. Actually, I was so naive. I thought I could go to Chicago and like find police records about there's this rumor that Ma Rainey was having, it's hard to say what she was hanging out with a bunch of her chorus girls after a show. And I mean, I sometimes refer to it as it seemed like it was maybe going to turn into a little bit of a sex party. It sounds as from her, actually it's written about in Bessie Smith's biography. They talk about how, everyone was getting comfortable and the lights were dimming and people were starting to take some of their clothes off. But then the cops showed up because I guess people had complained about them being rowdy. So allegedly, Ma Rainey runs out of this house and actually trips down the stairs and falls into the arms of the cops and gets arrested. And Bessie Smith allegedly bails her out of jail the next day. So I thought maybe at the very beginning of this process, which I thought maybe I would actually be able to like uncover actual sources about that, but of course I couldn't find anything about that. So we just treat it more kind of as a rumor. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. There's like a lot of I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that there's like a ton of like white dudes who are obsessed with the blues and like write a lot of like scholarship about the blues, like right, this is a thing. And like yeah, a lot of them write about like these rumors about Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey having a relationship, or have kind of have been being like a mentor and mentee, but having like a sexual aspect to that. But from what I've gathered, that was not true, and they were very aware of the rumors, and they would even kind of like make fun of them when they got together like later in life. And not that Bessie Smith lived to be that old, unfortunately. But
I
yeah.
had no clue that they knew each other.
They both, I mean, all these women were mostly performing on like the Black vaudeville circuits in the South, sometimes for like more than a decade, or sometimes 2 decades in Ma Rainey's case, before they were discovered by the white run like music industry in the North. So that's kind of the circuits that they met on. They mostly all start performing when they're pretty young, especially Bessie Smith. I believe she loses her parents quite young, and her brother are, they're like dancing in the streets for money, and then they start working on vaudeville shows. But yeah, it's in these old circuits. They play under canvas tents that often have drag queens who are known as tent queens at the time, and that's where Little Richard got his start in that context a little bit later on too.
Oh my gosh. Um, Exciting. So question 3, and maybe this leads into that. I'd be curious to hear what historical topic Professor Woolner plans to tackle next.
Oh my gosh, I would be curious too. I really would. Yeah, no, I have a lot of ideas. I think it's, it's very similar to being a musician. When you put out your first album and you worked at it a really long time and it's well received, and then you feel like this intense. Not like I feel a pressure from the outside. It's more just like what's up for my second act, what will come next. So that's kind of the phase I'm in still. I mean, what I'm drawn to doing, I think I like every white Gen X woman I know is doing the same thing. Like we all want to write like our memoir about the 90s, so I've always kind of wanted to do that a little bit, but that's very navel gazing, and that's not really, like academic work. Although now that I have tenure, I can technically do whatever I want to do. But yeah, so but I would love to do something about the 90s. I did get to once I was asked to do a talk on kind of like queer riot girl and queer feminism in the 90s, and that's a topic very near and dear to my heart. But it's also hard. There's something nice about writing about a much longer ago period that I don't have any personal connection to. It's much more complicated to write about a more contemporary time that I experienced as a young person and romanticized, but I'm trying to still get some like scholarly distance. I don't know. I know some people can accomplish that, but it definitely seems very challenging.
Um, so I think we probably have time for one more question. Um, Question 4 says, it was surprising to hear about W.E.B. Du Bois and Adam Clayton Powell's negative claims and sermons about homosexuality and sex perversion. It's actually not even in quotes. I don't know why I did that. Were there any other surprising moments you uncovered in your research or book writing process? I feel like you've answered this question.
I can speak to it more.
Yeah, but I'm sure there's hundreds, but
Yeah, no, let me think of surprises. Oh, this is the question I told you I get a lot, and I always draw a blank on it when someone asks me what the surprises I came across are.
it's
Um,
like, I mean,
also,
it's all pretty surprising too. Like the whole time I was like, what? What? Oh, what?
well, yeah, most people don't get a chance to learn a lot of queer history before Stonewall, so right, so it's definitely not what many people expect. What else is surprising? Hmm. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to think about that one a little bit more. I literally every time this happens, I just draw a huge blank, like I'm doing right
No,
now.
it's totally fine.
Are there
I
any
think
other?
I'll go to question 5,
Right.
because I think that's a really potent one. For those of us who are interested in specific moments in queer history, what are some tips you would give for us to get started in learning more?
Ooh, great question. Oh, there's so many wonderful resources today. One of my favorite kind of free resources, which is very fabulously curated, mostly by nerdy academic historians like me, is called outhistory.org. And it's just a really wonderful resource, kind of a one-stop shop to learn about really all facets of queer history. There's a lot of original content created by historians and other things you can find. So yeah, outhistory.org is a really great place to go. That's right. Oh, but it's run by Jonathan Ned Cat. Well, it was started by Jonathan Ned Katz, who I believe you sat for and has painted a portrait of you.
Yes. Oh, cool. No, it's beautiful. Um,
Oh, thank you for the link. Yeah, no, that is a really great place to start. Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's a good one to go to. And also, if anyone is specifically interested in Southern history, I'm going to give a shout out to the Invisible Histories Project. They're doing a really amazing work documenting queer life in the South. They also now have a queer, I think it's called Queer History South, a conference on queer Southern history that they do every year, every other year as well. So for anyone else interested in queer Southern life, that's a great resource. So
yeah. Well, that's all the questions. And I guess just on a real personal note, I love you so much, Cookie. And it was really nice to just read this book. And like as a queer Black Southerner and queer performer, I don't know. I feel like sometimes I get jaded with queer history or thinking that I know it all or the rundown of it. But it's always nice to be reminded that there's always another reason to live or
well,
that, one exists in a context. Oh wow, actually,
One more question, bring it on.
yeah, I know it's a really exciting one too. So, I just want to say thank you for doing this work, and I love you very much.
Thank you, my love.
Um, Final question, question 6. Did you come across any author, artist, or person who lived in this pre-Stonewall period that directly spoke to the class divide during this period between the old guard of Black folks and the new people migrating up from the South? Also, tenure, get it.
Oh my goodness. That's a great question. The first place my head is going to is just kind of like an anecdote that it reminds me of. So somebody I write about in the 4th chapter is Alice Dunbar Nelson, who is an amazing, important writer, activist. She was well known because she'd formerly been the wife of the poet Paul Dunbar. She was somebody who was seen as kind of coming from an elite background. She was kind of part of high society. But she was someone who sometimes had to like hawk her jewelry at the pawn shop to be able to afford to pay her bills before she like went off to like a very fancy meeting for like the National Colored Women's Association of America, right? So it really kind of gets at the fact that, many of these women are seen as middle class or elite, but they're usually only 1 or 2 generations removed from slavery at this point, right? So really kind of gets at these kind of tensions here.
It's amazing. So yeah, I think that's the time we have.
But thank you so much, everyone, for coming out and for all the questions and for hosting me. And yeah, if anyone wants to reach out about the book, you can contact me. I'm at Woolner at memphis.edu is my email. If anyone wants to say hi. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank y'all so much. Bye.